The house smelled like cold air and stale cartoons. I dropped my keys on the granite counter, waiting for the usual chaos of footsteps and high-pitched greetings. Instead, the silence felt heavy and deliberate. I checked the living room, finding my 4-year-old daughter, sitting motionless in front of flickering shadows. Her eyes were vacant. A single notification chimed on my phone, glowing like a warning flare. The message read, "My wife and daughter left me for a barista they met at a coffee shop." Then karma hit hard. I read the text 50 times until the words blurred into nonsense. Sarah was gone, taking her 2 sons, but leaving our little girl behind like forgotten luggage. The barista was a 23-year-old kid I had actually tipped 3 months ago. I remembered his smug grin and the way Sarah lingered at the counter while I wore my Packers hoodie. I thought they were just being friendly. Now, my 5-year marriage was reduced to a digital execution. She had been meeting him daily while I worked 12-hour shifts. The kitchen was a graveyard of dirty dishes and unpaid bills. I opened the fridge to find nothing but a half-empty carton of almond milk and a stack of coffee shop receipts. Sarah had stopped cooking weeks ago, claiming she was too tired from housework. The younger boy later told me she dropped them at school and disappeared for hours. She was chasing a boy who made minimum wage while I paid the mortgage. My hands shook as I realized my car was also missing from the driveway. I checked social media and felt a physical punch to my chest. Sarah had posted a photo of the barista leaning against my SUV. The caption praised her new soulmate and claimed she had finally found real love. She looked glowing and radiant, completely indifferent to the toddler crying in our living room. Her family started sending me screenshots of her, bragging about her freedom. They were sleeping in my car in random parking lots. She was choosing a literal van life over our daughter, her own biological child. Work became a blurred cycle of logistics and lies. My boss watched me from his glass office, noting my mismatched socks and hollow eyes. I spent my lunch breaks tracking the barista's social media, discovering his 10-year-old van barely ran. My wife was homeless by choice, dragging 2 innocent boys through a nightmare of motels and dark parks. I closed our joint bank accounts and reported the debit card stolen. I had to protect what was left. Then a loud, aggressive pounding echoed against my front door at midnight. 2 police officers stood on the porch with their arms crossed. Sarah stood behind them, looking bony and frantic, in the harsh strobe of their cruiser. She claimed I was holding her belongings hostage, a lie designed to gain entry. I stepped aside, watching her shove clothes into garbage bags with cold, mechanical movements. She didn't look toward the stairs where our daughter slept. Outside, the barista sat in my driver's seat, scrolling through his phone. He looked up and smirked at me through the glass. The officers watched as Sarah hauled the final black bag across the threshold. Her eyes remained fixed on the floor, avoiding the family photos lining the hallway. I felt a sudden urge to scream, but my throat remained tight and dry. "Is that everything?" I asked, my voice cracking in the humid night air. She didn't answer. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the plastic and stepped toward the driveway. A faint scent of cheap cigarettes followed her out. The barista leaned out of the car window, tapping a rhythmic beat on the roof. He looked younger in the moonlight, his skin pale and sallow. I watched my wife climb into the passenger seat of the vehicle I still paid for. The engine turned over with a pathetic, grinding whine before catching. They pulled away slowly, leaving 2 deep tire tracks in the wet grass. The silence that followed was louder than the engine's roar. Sarah never looked back. I went back inside and held my daughter, whispering that we would be okay, even if her mother chose a stranger over us. Morning brought a frantic call from the middle school principal. My oldest stepson had arrived in the same clothes he wore 3 days ago. He looked malnourished and refused to speak to his teachers. I grabbed my keys and raced toward the school, my mind spinning with legal threats. I had no biological right to him, but I was the only father he knew. The principal met me in the lobby with a concerned, tight expression. Something was very wrong. We sat in a cramped office smelling of floor wax and old paper. The boy sat in the corner, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. He finally looked up, his eyes rimmed with red from crying. "Mum says we have to move to the city park tonight," he whispered. My heart shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. He wasn't just tired, he was terrified. Sarah was trading their safety for a life of aimless wandering in parking lots. I left the school and drove straight to the local gas station. Sarah had texted me a crying emoji, begging for $20 to buy milk. I found her sitting on a concrete curb, her hair matted and greasy. She looked 20 years older than the woman who left 2 weeks ago. "Where are the boys, Sarah?" I demanded, standing over her. She just held out a shaking hand for the cash. Her nails were still perfect and bright pink. "They're fine, Graham. We just need a little help to get through the week," she muttered. She refused to look me in the eye, focusing instead on a discarded lottery ticket. I realized then that she wasn't coming back for the life we built. She was just using me as a human ATM for her new tragedy. I reached into my wallet and pulled out a single bill. As she grabbed it, I saw a dark bruise on her wrist. I stepped back, feeling a cold wave of realization wash over me. The barista wasn't just a lover, he was a catalyst for a much darker spiral. Sarah tucked the money into her pocket and stood up with a jagged, nervous laugh. "He loves me more than you ever did," she spat, turning toward the van. I watched her go, knowing I had to call CPS immediately. The older boy's backpack was still sitting on our living room floor. The phone call to Child Protective Services felt like signing a death warrant for my marriage. I stood in the quiet kitchen, staring at our daughter's favorite cereal bowl. The social worker's voice was clinical and detached as she took my statement about the parking lots. I detailed the bruises on Sarah's wrist and the boys missing school. My chest felt tight with a mixture of betrayal and desperate necessity. This was the only way to save them from her. I spent the next morning at the courthouse filing for emergency custody. The air in the building was thick with the scent of old coffee and despair. My lawyer looked at the photos of Sarah's social media posts with a grimace. He told me the legal path would be uphill because I never formally adopted the boys. I sat on a hard wooden bench, feeling the weight of my own failures. I was a stranger to the law. Suddenly, my phone vibrated with a series of frantic text messages from Sarah's mother. She had ignored my calls for weeks, but now she was terrified. Sarah had shown up at her house, screaming about a missing car payment. Her mother had locked the doors and called the police when the barista tried to break a window. The escalation was happening faster than I could track. My quiet life was dissolving into a public, violent spectacle. I drove toward her mother's neighborhood, my grip tightening on the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. When I arrived, the street was lined with neighbors watching the drama from their porches. Sarah was sitting on the curb, sobbing into her hands while a deputy stood nearby. The barista was nowhere to be seen. He had fled the moment the sirens got close. She looked small and broken beneath the yellow glow of the streetlights. I approached the deputy, showing him my identification and explaining the situation with our daughter. He nodded toward Sarah and told me she was being detained for a mental health evaluation. My heart skipped a beat as I looked at her. Her clothes were stained with something dark, and she smelled like cheap wine. I reached out to touch her shoulder, but she flinched away with a snarl. She didn't recognize the man who loved her. "Where are the boys, Sarah?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper in the wind. She looked at me with glazed eyes and pointed toward a nearby wooded trail. She claimed they were playing a game, but her voice lacked any real conviction. I felt a cold surge of adrenaline hit my system. I sprinted toward the trees, calling their names into the gathering shadows. The woods remained silent, offering no answers to my desperate cries. I found them huddling inside a hollowed-out log near the creek bed. They were shivering, clutching a single damp blanket between them. The older boy looked at me with a mixture of relief and deep, abiding shame. He held out a small, crumpled note that Sarah had given him earlier. It wasn't a message of love or a promise to return. It was a list of names and addresses for her local weed dealers, scribbled in her messy handwriting as if she were offering me a map to her new world. I led the boys out of the woods, their sneakers squelching in the mud. The social worker waited by her car, clutching a clipboard like a shield. She watched as I bundled the shivering kids into my back seat. They didn't protest or ask for their mother. They just stared at the dashboard with empty eyes. I handed the crumpled dealer list to the deputy. He looked at the names inside. Sarah was still sobbing on the curb nearby. We reached the hospital just as the sun began to dip below the horizon. The older boy's stomach pain had returned with a sharp, stabbing intensity. He could barely walk through the sliding glass doors of the emergency room. I checked him in while the younger one gripped my hand. But the fluorescent lights made everything look sterile and cold. A nurse ushered us into a small cubicle. The air smelled of rubbing alcohol and cheap floor wax. The doctor arrived minutes later with a grim expression on his face. He pressed his fingers against the boy's abdomen, eliciting a sharp cry of agony. "It's appendicitis," he said, looking directly at me. He explained that the surgery needed to happen within the hour. I felt a surge of panic. I wasn't their legal guardian. I didn't have the authority to sign the consent forms. The doctor asked for their mother's contact information immediately. I called Sarah 10 times before she finally picked up her phone. Her voice was thick and slurred, sounding like she was underwater. I explained the surgery and told her to get to the hospital. She started crying about the barista and how he was upset. "Your son is dying, Sarah," I snapped. I could hear a man yelling in the background of her call. She promised to be there in 20 minutes. I didn't believe her. 30 minutes passed before the double doors swung open with a bang. Sarah stumbled in, supported by the barista's thin, shaking arm. They both looked like they had been sleeping in a dumpster. The barista tried to puff out his chest when he saw me. He told me they were there to take charge. I felt my blood boil as he stepped toward the kids. Sarah didn't even look at her sick son. She looked at her boyfriend. The barista leaned in close, his breath smelling of stale coffee and cigarettes. "Were the adults here?" "Graham," he whispered with a smirk. He reached for the consent forms on the nurse's station. I stepped in front of him, my hands balling into fists. The nurse looked between us, her finger hovering over the security button. Sarah started rubbing the barista's arm, ignoring her son's whimpers. They were acting like a team against me. The surgeon walked out and ignored the barista entirely. He looked at Sarah and asked if she was the biological mother. She nodded slowly, her eyes darting toward the exit. He handed her the pen and pointed to the signature line. She signed it without reading a single word. Then she asked if she could leave to drop her boyfriend at work. He had a shift starting soon. She left her son on the gurney and walked away. I watched the hospital doors swing shut behind Sarah and her barista. The hallway felt colder once they vanished. My stepson was wheeled away toward the operating room, his small hand trailing off the edge of the gurney. I sat in a plastic chair that groaned under my weight. The younger brother sat beside me, his eyes fixed on a muted television. We were alone in a sea of sterile white. My phone buzzed with a new notification. It was a bank alert for a failed transaction at a local motel. Sarah was trying to use my canceled credit card to book a room for Jax and her while their oldest son lay in a recovery room down the hall. The audacity of her request made my skin crawl with a fresh layer of resentment. She was still prioritizing that boy's comfort over her son's recovery. I leaned my head against the cinderblock wall and closed my eyes. Every breath I took felt like inhaling broken glass. She was truly gone. 3 hours passed before a surgeon finally appeared in the doorway. He looked exhausted, his surgical cap pushed back to reveal a sweat-stained forehead. The surgery had been successful, but the appendix had been dangerously close to rupturing. He asked where the boy's mother had gone. I told him she had an emergency and left. He gave me a look that said he had seen this exact brand of neglect before. It was a silent, professional judgment. I moved the boys into a private recovery room as dawn broke. The older one was drifting in and out of a drug-induced sleep. He looked so fragile beneath the heavy hospital blankets. I realized then that I couldn't keep doing this halfway. I needed to be their father in every legal sense of the word. I took out my laptop and began drafting a long email to my lawyer. It was time for a war. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor to the hospital floor. It wasn't Sarah. It was the weed dealer I had chased off my porch the night before. He was wearing a leather jacket and looking suspiciously at the security cameras. He caught my eye and gestured for me to step into the hallway. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I followed him out, my hands balled into tight, defensive fists. "She sent me here, man," he whispered, leaning against a vending machine. He held out a small, tattered backpack that belonged to my younger stepson. He said Sarah had traded it for a single bag of product. My stomach churned at the thought of her bartering their belongings for a fix. She was sinking into a hole that had no bottom. I took the bag from him without saying a word. He turned and walked away. I opened the backpack and found a hidden pocket near the bottom. Inside was a crumpled photograph of our wedding day and a burner phone. The phone began to vibrate in my palm immediately. I answered it, expecting to hear Sarah's frantic voice. Instead, a man's voice told me I had 1 hour to deliver the car. If I didn't show up, he would call the police and report me for kidnapping the boys. I stared at the burner phone, my thumb hovering over the end call button. The man's voice was like gravel scraping against a metal pipe. He was Jax's older brother, a man Sarah had never mentioned. He claimed the SUV was legally hers, and I was obstructing her freedom. I looked at my stepson's pale face as he slept through his post. Op Hayes. If I left now, I risked everything I had built for their safety. The threat of kidnapping was a sharp, jagged blade. I walked to the hospital window and watched the rain streak across the glass. Below, a beat-up van idled near the emergency entrance, its headlights flickering like dying stars. I knew they were waiting for me to brake. I called my lawyer, but her voicemail was a dead end. I had to handle this with cold, clinical precision. I wouldn't give them the car, but I couldn't ignore the police threat. The power was shifting toward the shadows. My daughter deserved a father, not a prisoner. The younger boy tugged at my sleeve, his face a mask of pure exhaustion. "Is Mommy coming back with him?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. I didn't lie to him this time. I told him we were staying here until his brother was strong enough to walk. He nodded and crawled back into the vinyl chair, clutching the tattered backpack I had recovered. He didn't know about the burner phone or the threats. He only knew the hospital felt safer than the woods. He fell asleep. I took the burner phone into the hallway and dialed the number back. My voice was steady, a sharp contrast to the fire burning in my chest. I told the man that the vehicle was in my name and the payments were mine. I mentioned the dealer list and the police report I had already filed against Sarah. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear Sarah whispering in the background, her voice frantic and high. She sounded like a stranger. "Give her the car, Graham. And we leave the kids alone," the man growled. It was a trade I couldn't accept because Sarah would just vanish with the boys again. I told him the car was being reported as stolen within the hour. The threat of a grand theft auto charge finally silenced his bravado. I hung up and pulled the battery from the burner phone. I felt a strange sense of relief wash over me. I was finally done playing her game. I returned to the room and found a social worker waiting by the bed. She had a folder full of documents and a stern, pitying look. She told me that Sarah had been picked up for a public disturbance at a motel. The state was taking temporary custody of the boys because of the hospital abandonment. My heart stopped beating for a second. I wasn't their legal kin. I was just the man who had raised them for 5 long years. Everything was falling apart. The social worker explained that the boys would be placed in foster care by morning. I stood my ground, refusing to let them take the children from the room. I showed her the school records, the medical bills, and the photos of our life. I pleaded with her to see the truth. She looked at the sleeping boys and sighed, her professional armor cracking. There was a loophole, if I could find a blood relative to take them. I thought of Chloe, Sarah's younger sister, who had always been the level-headed one in that family. I prayed she would still take my call. I called the sister, a woman who had been ghosted by Sarah for months. She answered on the first ring, her voice thick with tears. I explained the situation and the immediate danger the boys were in. She didn't hesitate for a single second. She promised to drive through the night to reach the hospital. She would sign the papers to keep them with me. It was a desperate, fragile plan. We just had to wait for the sunrise to bring her. The hours ticked by like slow drips of acid. I watched the door, expecting the police or the barista to burst through at any moment. The older boy finally woke up and asked for a glass of water. His fever had broken, and his eyes were clear for the first time in weeks. I held the cup for him, my hands finally still. We sat in the quiet, watching the sky turn a bruised shade of purple. The nightmare was far from over. The sun finally rose, casting long shadows across the hospital parking lot. I saw a familiar car pull into the visitor section. Sarah's sister stepped out, looking determined and wary. At the same time, the barista's van sped away, disappearing into the morning traffic. They had given up the chase. I looked at the boys and knew I would fight any judge in the world to keep them. I was no longer a provider. I was a protector. I felt free. Sarah's sister, Chloe, moved through the hospital corridors like a woman on a mission. She met the social worker in a small, glass-walled conference room. I watched through the window as they exchanged documents and signatures. My heart hammered a steady, anxious rhythm against my ribs. After an hour, Chloe walked out with a faint, tired smile. She had secured temporary kinship placement for the boys. They were safe from the foster system for now. But Sarah was still out there, a ghost in the machine. We moved the boys out of the hospital under a gray, drizzling sky. Chloe followed my car back to the house I had worked so hard to keep. The neighborhood looked different now, like a stage set after the lights had dimmed. I unlocked the front door and let the boys inside. They headed straight for their bedrooms, their feet heavy on the carpet. My daughter ran to them, her small face lighting up with pure joy. The family was back, but the foundation was cracked. The next morning, a process server arrived with a thick envelope of legal papers. Sarah was suing me for the return of the SUV and child support for the boys. She claimed I had kidnapped them from the hospital under duress. My lawyer called 10 minutes later, her voice tight with professional concern. We needed a solid defense against these wild allegations. I looked at the receipts I had saved from the coffee shop. I had a paper trail of her neglect and her spending habits. I spent the afternoon changing every lock on the exterior doors of the house. The metallic rasp of the file against the brass felt like a form of meditation. I was building a fortress against the woman I once loved. Chloe stayed in the guest room, acting as a buffer between the kids and the chaos. She told me Sarah had called her, screaming about the barista's missing car keys. It seemed Jax was losing his patience with the lifestyle Sarah had chosen for them. The tension in the house snapped when the younger stepson disappeared from his room. We searched the backyard and the garage, calling his name until our voices were raw. I found him hiding in the crawl space, beneath the porch, clutching a broken toy. He was terrified that the barista would come back to take him away. I pulled him out and held him close, feeling his small frame shake. He didn't want the adventure anymore. He just wanted a door that stayed locked. Later that night, the barista's van appeared at the end of our quiet street. He sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling with a low, menacing growl. I stood on the porch, my hands tucked into my pockets. I didn't call the police this time. I simply picked up my phone and dialed the number of the weed dealer. I told him where he could find the man who owed him $2,000. The van's lights flickered once before it sped away. The following Monday, my lawyer met me at the courthouse for the custody hearing. Sarah arrived late, her clothes wrinkled and her eyes bloodshot. She didn't have a lawyer. She stood before the judge and tried to explain her life crisis as a spiritual journey. The judge looked at the medical records from the appendectomy and Sarah's social media posts. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Sarah started to realize that her charm had no power in this room. The tide was turning. The judge granted me temporary legal guardianship of the stepsons and full custody of my daughter. Sarah was ordered to undergo a psychiatric evaluation and drug testing before any visitation. She let out a jagged, hollow laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. She turned to me and hissed that I was a cold, controlling monster. I didn't feel the sting of her words anymore. I just felt a profound sense of relief. The weight of her drama was finally off my back. We walked out of the courthouse into a bright, biting October wind. Chloe hugged me and promised to stay as long as the boys needed her. I drove home, stopping to buy 3 large pizzas and a new box of crayons. The house felt warm and full when we walked through the door. The boys started their homework at the kitchen table while my daughter colored. It was a normal afternoon, a simple miracle I had fought to earn back. I was home. I sat in my armchair and watched them, a glass of water in my hand. My phone buzzed on the side table with a final text from an unknown number. It was a photo of the wedding rings sitting on a pawn shop counter. Sarah had sold the last piece of our history for a handful of cash. I deleted the message without saving the image. I looked at my kids and realized the rings were just metal. The real treasure was breathing in this room. The legal battle subsided into a tense, fragile peace as winter approached. I spent my evenings organizing school folders and cooking the heavy meals Sarah once mastered. The boys grew quiet but steady, their eyes losing that hollow, hunted look from the parking lots. I stopped checking her social media entirely, cutting the final digital tether to her chaos. My bank account began to recover now that the secret coffee shop tabs were gone. I felt like a man emerging from a long, suffocating tunnel. Disney World brochures sat on the kitchen table, a promise of a new beginning for the 4 of us. The kids whispered about the trip while they packed their small suitcases. I felt a rare sense of pride as I watched them cooperate. My daughter hadn't asked for her mother in over 3 weeks. She was learning to rely on the people who actually stayed. It was a victory, yet the house still felt too large at night. Some ghosts are louder when they are silent. A final, unexpected letter arrived via certified mail on a Tuesday morning. It wasn't from Sarah, but from a local repo agency. The car I had fought to keep was being flagged for an old, hidden lien Sarah created. She had used the title as collateral for a private loan just weeks before she vanished. My hands shook as I realized her final act of spite was still unfolding from a distance. She was trying to strip away our only means of transportation. I had to act fast. I drove to the agency office, my jaw set in a hard, determined line. The manager was a tired man who had seen 1,000 broken families. He looked at my papers and sighed, pointing to a signature that clearly wasn't mine. Sarah had forged my name to get the quick cash. The power balance shifted instantly from a civil dispute to a criminal matter. I didn't feel the usual urge to protect her reputation. I asked him to call the local police. The officer who arrived was the same man who witnessed Sarah's hospital abandonment. He remembered the boys and the barista. He took the forged documents and told me this would trigger an active warrant for her arrest. I felt a cold, sharp stone settle in my stomach. By seeking justice for the car, I was effectively ending her freedom. There was no way to save the vehicle without destroying her. I looked at the pen and signed the official criminal complaint. We left for the airport the next morning in a rented sedan, the kids cheering in the back. I looked in the rearview mirror as we passed the neighborhood coffee shop. A new barista was working the morning rush, oblivious to the lives wrecked over a lat. My phone buzzed one last time with a restricted number. I didn't answer it. I simply dropped the device into a trash bin near the boarding gate. My life was finally my own. No more ghosts allowed.